The year was 1881, and the grief of the Cheyenne chief, Honyahaka, was a season unto itself. It had settled over the land his people occupied, a cold mist that clung to the valleys long after the sun had risen. It had been a year since he had buried his daughter, Mesa, a year since the laughter had been stolen from his lodge, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The world had continued its turning, the pines had shed and grown their needles, the creek had frozen and thawed, but Honyahaka's heart remained a frozen, desolate landscape. He performed his duties as chief with a hollowed-out precision, his decisions sound, his counsel wise, but his spirit was absent. It walked somewhere else, in the ghost lands of memory, forever chasing the shadow of a little girl with eyes like polished obsidian and a smile like the summer dawn. His people gave him space, a respectful distance that was its own kind of pain. They saw the way he would pause mid-sentence, his gaze lost on the horizon. They saw him walk the forest paths alone, his broad shoulders stooped with a burden no one could help him carry. The forest had once been a place of joy, where he had taught Mesa the names of the trees, the tracks of the deer, and the language of the wind. Now, it was a cathedral of his sorrow. Each rustle of leaves was a whisper of her name, each dappled patch of sunlight, a reminder of her fleeting presence. He went there not for solace, but to steep himself in the ache, because the ache was all he had left of her. It was on one such day, with the autumn air crisp and smelling of pine and damp earth, that he found her. He was following a game trail that wound deep into the shadowed heart of the woods, a place few others ventured. He was not hunting. He was simply moving, trying to walk away from the stillness that haunted his lodge. A sound, thin and sharp, cut through the murmur of the forest. It was not the cry of a hawk or the complaint of a jay. It was a sound of distress, fragile and human. Honyahaka stopped, his head cocked, every sense honed by a lifetime in the wild. He moved toward the sound, his steps silent on the thick carpet of fallen needles. There, in a small clearing where a great oak had fallen long ago, was a small, huddled shape. At first, he thought it was a pale fawn, caught in a snare. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a child, a girl. She was backed against the rotting log, her small body trembling uncontrollably. But it was her appearance that made him freeze. Her hair was the color of winter frost, a stark, shocking white that cascaded around her shoulders in a tangled mess. Her skin was as pale as milk, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were the faint, watery blue of a sky just before a storm. An albino child. She was not of his people. She was a child of the white settlers, yet she was utterly alone. Her dress, a simple cotton frock, was torn and filthy. She was impossibly thin, the bones of her face sharp and delicate under her translucent skin. But it was the mark on her forearm that made a low growl rumble in Honyahaka's chest. Burned into her pale flesh was a crude, star-like symbol, the skin around it red, swollen, and weeping. A brand. They had marked her like cattle, like a thing to be owned and discarded. He knew what the settlers in the nearby town of Providence called people like her. They used words steeped in fear and ignorance. Witch. Devil spawn. The brand was a verdict, and the forest was her execution chamber. The child flinched, pulling her arm close as if to hide the mark. A whimper escaped her lips, a sound of pure terror. She saw not a man, but a towering figure of shadow and leather, a stranger whose presence meant only more pain. Honyahaka saw something else. He saw a child, no older than Mesa would have been. He saw the same fragile bird-boned wrists, the same terrifying vulnerability. The grief that had been a cold, dead weight in his chest suddenly ignited with a white-hot spark of fury. Fury at the cruelty of the world, at the people who could do this to a child and call themselves righteous. Slowly, deliberately, he knelt. He made himself smaller, less threatening. He held out his empty hands, palms up, a gesture of peace his own daughter had understood. The silence of the forest pressed in around them, broken only by the child's ragged breathing. He stayed like that for a long time, a statue of patient sorrow, until the trembling in her small limbs began to subside, replaced by a weary exhaustion. The fight was leaving her. She had been alone for days, he guessed, with no food and little water. He remembered the strip of dried venison in his pouch. He pulled it out slowly, holding it toward her. She stared at it, her pale eyes wide with a mixture of hunger and suspicion. He placed it gently on the ground between them and retreated a step. Her gaze darted from the jerky to his face and back again. Finally, the gnawing emptiness in her belly won out. With a swift, furtive movement, she snatched the meat and crammed it into her mouth, chewing with a desperate ferocity. In that moment, the ice around Honyahaka's heart cracked. The grief was still there, a vast and aching sea, but on its shore, something new had washed up, a purpose. He could not save his own daughter from the fever that had stolen her away, but he could save this one from the hatred that had cast her out. He did not know her name. He did not know her story, beyond what the brand told him. It did not matter. He saw a daughter, and he would not leave her to die. He brought her back to his lodge, carrying her when her weak legs gave out. The journey was a silent one, the child a feather-light weight in his powerful arms, her white hair stark against the dark buckskin of his shirt. When he entered the village, a hush fell. Eyes followed him, filled with questions and a dawning unease. They saw the pale, otherworldly child he carried, and they saw the look on their chief's face, a look of grim determination they had not seen since before Mesa's passing. He took her into his lodge, the one that had been a tomb of memories, and gently closed the flap, shutting out the world and its judgment. For the first time in a year, Honyahaka was not entirely alone in his grief. He now had a small, terrified, and branded ghost to share it with. Inside the lodge, the air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and cedar. Honyahaka laid the girl on a soft buffalo robe near the central fire pit. She immediately curled into a tight ball, her strange, light eyes tracking his every move. He moved with a deliberate slowness, speaking to her in the soft, melodic tones of the Cheyenne tongue, knowing she would not understand the words, but hoping she would understand the intent. He brought her a bowl of cool water, which she drank thirstily, her small hands shaking. He knew he had to tend to the brand. It was a vile wound, and infection was already setting in. When he gently reached for her arm, she recoiled with a cry, scrambling away from him until her back hit the curved wall of the lodge. Fear, stark and absolute, radiated from her. He stopped, holding his hands up again. This would take a patience he wasn't sure he still possessed. He sat back on his heels, not moving, simply waiting. He began to hum a lullaby, the same one his mother had hummed to him, the same one he had hummed to Mesa when she was restless. It was a simple, repetitive melody, a sound of peace and safety. He hummed for what felt like an hour, his voice a low, steady drone against the crackle of the fire. The tension slowly bled from the girl's body. Her eyelids began to droop. She was fighting a battle between terror and total exhaustion. He prepared a poultice of chewed willow bark and yarrow, his movements economical and practiced. When he saw her eyes finally close, he moved toward her again, as silently as a hunting cat. This time, when he reached for her arm, she only flinched, too tired to resist further. He worked quickly, his large, calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the wound. The burn was deep, the edges ragged. The symbol was an affront, a mark of deepest ignorance. He applied the soothing poultice, the herbs immediately beginning their work of drawing out the heat and the poison. He wrapped her arm in a clean strip of soft doeskin. As he finished, her eyes fluttered open. She looked at her bandaged arm, then up at his face. There was no understanding in her expression, only a profound, bottomless weariness. He covered her with another fur, and within moments she was lost in a deep, troubled sleep. Honyahaka sat by the fire, watching her, the silence of the lodge no longer empty, but filled with the fragile presence of a life he had sworn to protect. The next few days established a quiet, fragile routine. The girl, whom he soon learned was named Lillian after she whispered it once in a feverish sleep, remained mostly silent. She ate the broth and softened meats he prepared for her, her hunger still ravenous. She watched him constantly, her pale eyes like a hawk's, assessing his every move. Honyahaka did not press her. He moved about the lodge, mending his tools, stretching a hide, his presence a steady, non-threatening constant. He left the lodge flap open during the day, so she could see the sky and hear the sounds of the village, so she would know she was not a prisoner. His people were divided. Wovoka, an elder whose eyes were clouded with the cataracts of age and superstition, spoke against the child's presence. "She is not of our blood," he warned in council. "She has the hair of a ghost and the skin of a corpse. The white men who cast her out are fearful of her power. Why would you bring that ill omen into your own lodge, Honyahaka? Your grief clouds your judgment." Others were more compassionate. A woman named Neva, whose own children were grown, saw only a child in need. "The chief's heart has been closed for a year," she argued softly. "This child has opened it. Is that not a powerful omen in itself? She is a helpless girl, not a spirit." Honyahaka listened to them all, his face impassive. When they had finished, he stood. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, but held the unbreakable strength of granite. "I found her left for the wolves. She was branded for the crime of her birth. I will not do what her cruel people have done. She is a child. She has no one. Now she has me. She will remain in my lodge. She is under my protection." He looked directly at Wovoka. "My judgment is clear. It is my heart that was clouded. It is beginning to see again." There was no further argument. The chief had spoken, and his word was law. Slowly, tentatively, Lillian began to emerge from her shell of fear. One morning, Honyahaka was carving a piece of cottonwood, his knife shaping the form of a small horse. It was an idle habit, something to keep his hands busy. He had carved dozens of such figures for Mesa. He finished the horse, smoothing its edges with a piece of sandstone, and placed it on the floor near where Lillian sat. He did not look at her or say a word. He simply left it there and went about his tasks. For a long time, she did not move. Then, when she thought he was not looking, a small, pale hand reached out and tentatively touched the wooden horse. Her fingers traced its shape, and for the first time since he had found her, Honyahaka saw something other than fear or exhaustion on her face. It was a flicker of childlike wonder. He began to teach her words. He would point to the fire and say, "Ista," to the water and say, "Mni." She was a quick study, her young mind a thirsty sponge. She would repeat the words in a small, hushed voice, her pronunciation clumsy but earnest. In return, she taught him a few of her own. "Fire," she whispered one evening, pointing. "Water." It was a bridge being built, word by word, across a chasm of culture and pain. The turning point came one night when a fierce thunderstorm rolled down from the mountains. The wind howled like a grieving animal, and thunder cracked the sky open. Honyahaka was woken by a small, trembling body pressing against his back. It was Lillian. She had crawled from her own sleeping furs, terrified of the violent sounds. He did not say anything. He simply shifted, making room for her, and pulled the heavy buffalo robe over her small frame. She burrowed against him, her small hands clutching his buckskin shirt. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his ribs. He began to hum the old lullaby, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm's fury. He hummed until her trembling subsided and her breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. In the dark, with the storm raging outside, he realized this was the first time she had willingly sought him out for comfort. This small act of trust was more powerful than any treaty, more meaningful than any council debate. He was no longer just her rescuer, he was becoming her safe harbor. News of the white spirit child in the Cheyenne chief's lodge traveled on the wind, carried by trappers and traders to the muddy streets of Providence. The town was a raw collection of clapboard buildings huddled against the vastness of the prairie, a place where faith and fear were often indistinguishable. It was a community that had recently suffered a bout of lung fever, and their meager corn crop was withering from a lack of rain. They needed someone to blame. Garrett Vance was the man who gave their fear a voice. He was not a preacher, but he spoke like one, his words filled with fire and damnation. He was a stern, unforgiving man whose authority was built on the superstitions of his neighbors. He had been the one to pronounce Lillian a witch, the one who had held her down while another man heated the branding iron. He had seen her pale skin and hair not as a natural curiosity, but as a mark of Cain, an unnatural blight upon God's world. He had convinced the townsfolk that her presence was the source of their misfortune. Leaving her in the woods was not murder in his eyes, it was a cleansing. When he heard she was alive, living among the savages, his rage was biblical. It was a perversion of the natural order. He saw it as a test of his authority and his faith. He began to preach in the town square, his voice ringing with righteous fury. He spoke of the devil consorting with the heathen, of a curse that had not been purged, but had merely found a new home. "That creature has tainted them," he roared, his face red with exertion. "She is a pestilence. As long as she draws breath, our crops will fail, and our children will sicken. The Lord demands we retrieve what is his and purify it with fire." His words found fertile ground in the anxious hearts of the townsfolk. A posse was formed, a grim collection of farmers and shopkeepers armed with rifles and a self-righteous certainty. They were not warriors, but fear made them dangerous. They rode out from Providence at dawn, a dark line of men moving across the prairie. Their destination, the Cheyenne village, their purpose to reclaim the witch child and finish what they had started. Word of their approach came from a young Cheyenne hunter who had seen the dust cloud from a high ridge. The village stirred like a disturbed anthill. Warriors took up their rifles and bows, their faces set in hard lines. Women gathered the children, their expressions anxious. This was the moment Wovoka had warned of. The child had brought trouble. Honyahaka stood before his lodge, watching the preparations. Lillian, now called Vavina by the tribe, a name meaning fawn, for her quiet, watchful nature, stood beside him. She understood enough of the commotion to be terrified. She clutched his hand, her knuckles white. He looked down at her frightened, upturned face, and felt a protective instinct so fierce it was a physical force. This was not about an omen or a curse. This was about a father protecting his daughter. He handed his rifle to a young warrior. "No one fires unless I give the word," he commanded. He would not meet violence with violence, not yet. He would meet them as a chief. He walked to the edge of the village, alone and unarmed, and waited. The posse reined in their horses 100 yards away, their faces a mixture of bravado and unease. Garrett Vance dismounted, his long duster coat swirling around his boots. He strode forward, his rifle held loosely in one hand. "Honyahaka." Vance's voice was a harsh bark. "We've come for the child. She is an abomination, a curse on this land. Give her to us, and there will be no trouble between our peoples." Honyahaka remained still, a figure of immense, unshakable calm. "The child you speak of is my daughter," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance. It was the first time he had said the words aloud, and they settled into his soul with the weight of absolute truth. "Her name is Vavina. She is of my lodge, and under my protection." Vance laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Your daughter, you would claim a demon as your own. She has brought sickness to our town. The Lord has marked her as unclean." "It was not your Lord who marked her," Honyahaka replied, his voice dropping, becoming as cold and sharp as river ice. "It was you, Vance, with hot iron." He took a step forward. "You speak of a curse. I will show you a curse." He turned and beckoned toward his lodge. After a moment's hesitation, Vavina emerged, walking on trembling legs to his side. She hid behind him, peeking out at the line of armed men. Honyahaka gently took her left arm, the one with the brand, and held it out for them to see. The wound had healed into a puckered, ugly scar, a permanent mutilation on her pale skin. "This is your work," he said, his voice resonating with a profound, grieving authority. "This is the mark of your God, a God who fears a child. A God who demands you burn the skin of the innocent." He looked past Vance, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the other men. Many of them were fathers themselves. They shifted uncomfortably, their eyes dropping from the sight of the scarred little arm. "I, too, have lost a daughter," Honyahaka continued, his voice thick with a pain that was raw and universal. "I know what it is to have a hole in your spirit that can never be filled. But my grief did not teach me to hate. It did not teach me to fear a child who is different. You speak of sickness. The only sickness I see here is in your hearts. It is a sickness of fear and cruelty." He drew Vivina close, shielding her with his body. He stood straight and tall, the chief of his people, a father defending his own. "This child is my daughter now. Her home is here. If you wish to take her, you must come through me, and you must come through every one of my warriors." He gestured to the silent line of men who had fanned out behind him, their weapons ready. "Leave now. Go back to your town and pray to your God. Pray that he forgives you for what you have done, for I will not." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The men of the posse looked at each other, their righteous certainty crumbling into shame and doubt. They saw not a heathen chief spouting empty threats, but a man of profound dignity. They saw a small, scarred child cowering behind him. They saw the unwavering resolve of the Cheyenne warriors. The odds had changed. This was not a simple matter of purging a curse anymore. This would be a bloody fight, and for what? For the right to harm a child. One by one, the men lowered their rifles. One of them turned his horse and began to ride away. Then another, Garrett Vance, stood alone, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. He had lost control. His crusade had dissolved in the face of a father's love and a chief's quiet strength. He spat on the ground, his eyes burning with hatred for Honyahaka, but he was beaten. He turned and stormed back to his horse, swinging himself into the saddle. Without a backward glance, he galloped away, his remaining posse trailing behind him like a tattered flag of defeat. The immediate threat had passed. The air in the Cheyenne village, which had been thick with tension, slowly cleared. The warriors lowered their weapons. Honyahaka stood for a long moment, watching the dust settle on the horizon. He felt Vivina's small hand tighten in his. He knelt and looked into her eyes. The terror was gone, replaced by an expression of awe and a dawning, absolute trust. She had seen him stand against the world for her. He lifted her into his arms and carried her back toward his lodge. As he walked, he passed the elder, Wovoka. The old man met his gaze and gave a slow, deep nod. It was a gesture of respect, an admission of error. He saw now that the child was not an ill omen. She was the medicine Honyahaka's wounded spirit had needed. She had not brought weakness, she had reminded their chief of his own formidable strength. In the weeks and months that followed, a new equilibrium settled over the village and within Honyahaka's soul. Vivina blossomed under his care. The haunted, feral look in her eyes was replaced by the bright curiosity of a healthy child. Her laughter, at first a rare and startling sound, became a common music within the lodge. She learned the Cheyenne language fluently, though she always retained the soft accent of her birth tongue. The people of the village accepted her. Neva taught her to bead moccasins, and the other children, seeing her not as a ghost, but as the chief's daughter, included her in their games. She was different, yes, but she was one of them. Honyahaka was transformed. The heavy cloak of his grief had not vanished, but it no longer defined him. It had become a part of the tapestry of his life, a dark thread that made the brighter ones seem all the more vibrant. He led his people with renewed vigor and wisdom, his heart open again. He taught Vivina the things he had once taught Mesa: how to read the clouds, how to find the sweetest berries, the stories of the stars. The memories of his first daughter were no longer just a source of pain. They were lessons, legacies he could pass on to the daughter he had been given. Sometimes, when he watched Vivina run through the tall prairie grass, her white hair flying behind her like a banner of sunlight, he would see a ghostly image of Mesa running beside her. And for the first time, the vision did not bring a tear to his eye. It brought a quiet smile to his lips. He had not replaced the daughter he had lost. He had simply made his heart big enough to love another. One cool evening, years later, he and Vivina sat outside the lodge, watching the sky bruise into nightfall. She was a young woman now, strong and graceful, her pale features a unique and beautiful counterpoint to the rich culture she had embraced as her own. She rested her head on his shoulder, a comfortable, familiar gesture. "Father," she said softly, using the Cheyenne word, "do you ever think of them, the people in the town?" Honyahaka gazed into the crackling fire, the flames dancing in his dark eyes. He thought of Garrett Vance and the hard-faced men who had ridden with him. He felt no hatred, only a distant pity. "They were afraid," he said simply. "Fear makes people do terrible things. They looked at you and saw a monster because they did not have the courage to see a child." He looked at her, his expression full of a deep and abiding love. "They threw away a treasure because they could not see its worth. Their loss was my greatest gift." He had found her in the deepest winter of his soul, a child branded by hatred and abandoned to the wilderness. But to him, the grieving Cheyenne chief, she was not the witch they had named her. She was the daughter of his heart, the unexpected spring that had brought his world back to life. Together, they had built a home not of blood, but of fierce, protective lover bond, stronger than any prejudice, a testament to the resilience of a spirit to heal and find its purpose in the most unexpected of places.